My name is Amy Vidor. I have a PhD in Comparative Literature from UT. I currently work for MELE Associates as the head of learning and development. My first job after completing my PhD was a postdoctoral fellowship that I had as part of a 3-year program with the Andrew Mellon Foundation at UT. However, my first job after that postdoc was serving as the content manager for an education technology platform that's called Curious. And I basically got that job for a couple of reasons. So as a PhD student and also in the early days of my graduate work in general, I was really interested in working in kind of like blogging spaces and translating academic research for general audiences. So helping faculty understand what is it that I can do to make my research more accessible, to help people understand what it is I do. For example, if I'm working in an archive. And so I had worked with a colleague of mine on a couple of projects that were funded through the Humanities Media Project, which was at the time sponsored by the College of Liberal Arts at UT. And what the Humanities Media Project had was a couple different platforms. So they had a podcast series, and I worked as a podcast writer for a couple of their short podcasts initially, and eventually had my own podcast that I created with my colleague Caroline Barda that was called Archival Fever, and really delved into different examples of archives in and around Austin to help audiences understand what it is, for example, humanities researchers do while working in archives. What does that look like? What is an archive? And so a lot of that experience really translated into the role that I had at Curious as a content manager. Because I was managing digital content, I was also managing a team of teachers and contract writers. And so a lot of that experience I had gained while doing that work at UT. The best career advice I received during my graduate program was actually from my co-chair of my dissertation. And I should say that from essentially day one of my graduate program, I knew I did not want to pursue a tenure track position. As much as I love teaching and research, I recognized that that wasn't the path that I wanted to choose. And so I was very deliberate and transparent throughout graduate school and letting my advisors and team know that that was the path I was pursuing, was looking at careers in industry. And so, one of the things that I talked about with my co-chair, who I actually worked with as a research assistant, was on the possibilities of career paths. And she actually told me something that still makes me laugh to this day, but basically she said, "You're too charismatic not to work with people." And I took that as a compliment, but she said one of the things that she's had a lot of experience with is that in industry, whether that is adjacent to academia or not, the people who are successful are the people who can communicate, who can clearly articulate what it is they do and explain the value not only of their role and responsibilities, but also be able to connect on a personal level with the people they're engaging with. And that's a skill that I would say is probably one of the hardest to acquire. If you don't have a lot of opportunities to practice, working in teams, especially in graduate school, and then you're put into a situation in an industry where you're expected to regularly build relationships, that can be a really challenging skill to acquire. And so I think that advice kind of has resonated with me throughout my career in thinking through what it is that I excel at, but also what it is I want to be doing in my day-to-day work. So I would say there is no typical day in my position. Every day in my position really is driven around the responsibilities of the company that I support. So in my role, I work for a small business, but I actually consult directly with the National Nuclear Security Administration on a daily basis. They're my primary client. And so a lot of the work that I do in learning and development revolves around the mission priorities of the offices that I support. And so in terms of skills that translate from graduate school into the work that I do right now, I would say there are a couple of things that really prepared me for this role. First of all, I do a lot of pedagogy, right? I do a lot of digital work, not only creating e-learning, but also facilitating workshops, hosting brown bags, bringing in researchers and academics across the country, because the team that I support is primarily senior staff. I work with scientists, engineers, program managers, budget analysts, the majority of whom have a graduate degree. And so I am working with a group of specialists who are really accustomed to high-level research. They are in many rights the senior most experts in their field, and so they are also typically publishing, for example, the research that they're doing, or they're articulating their research or their work and services to stakeholders like Congress, for example. And so in terms of my day-to-day work, a lot of my responsibility is helping them, again, translate the work that they're doing for different stakeholders and for different audiences. And in terms of training, really where I help people with their development, I see that very much akin to teaching in a classroom setting. Especially at UT, I had the opportunity to do a lot of curriculum development and mentoring with students. And that really translates into career development, finding people's strengths, helping them identify opportunities, recognizing maybe where people should avoid, moving their career, for example. A lot of work that I did as a postdoc at UT, for example, was really focused on career skills for graduate students. How could they transfer those skills? And I think a lot of people still have those questions, whether they're in the middle of their career, the beginning of their career, or even the end of their career, right? It's like, what's next for me? Do I want to actually advance? What would that look like? I would say the most interesting project that I've worked in, that I'm working on currently actually, is focused on kind of improving 3 areas of the workplace for my client. So we call this project Project Horizon, and it's really about building the organization of the future by empowering our workforce, focused on a couple key areas, including professional development. And one of the things that I've had the opportunity to do is actually build out a diversity, equity, inclusivity, and accessibility initiative, which is centered around coaching and mentoring. So I've had the opportunity to work with a third party and actually bring in executive coaching and coaching circles for our leadership so that we can really build a workplace where the values of DEI are not only just things that people check off. I participated in a training on unconscious bias, or I understand how to intervene in different situations, or I recognize performance bias when I'm evaluating individuals on my staff who are caretakers, right? It's not just about looking at factors like that, but really understanding how, when we are given an opportunity like right now, where our workforce is entirely remote, how we can build out and develop new talent, how we can recruit from perhaps, for example, minority serving institutions, and really make sure that once those individuals are brought onto our team, that they are empowered and have the opportunity to actually advance their careers. Because in the industry that I support, which is primarily STEM-based, we do have a very traditional demographic in terms of leadership hierarchy. We have, for example, I think the agency-wide statistics are something like 70% of staff are white men. And that of course leaves less than 30% for people who identify as women. And when you start looking at other demographics such as access to education or backgrounds or language, anything like that, those are factors that are really not represented across the agency. And so I think that's probably been one of the most exciting projects for me, is because it's an opportunity to not only impact what's happening with the organization today, but really building a plan so that in 20 or 30 years, there's actually a pipeline of talent that represents more the individuals and I would say the demographics of America, especially in a federal agency. I think that's really important. I have actually served on a hiring committee and hired a couple different people for my company. And in particular, what I've been looking for on resumes for graduate students who have recently completed a program, or in some cases are still enrolled in a program, we do occasionally offer internships, for example. And so, I've seen a lot of different resumes, but what I would say is I'm looking for a couple things. So first of all, I'm looking to understand what it is they've done beyond perhaps the traditional roles and responsibility of graduate work. So for example, if they have been a teaching assistant or an assistant instructor, what does that look like? Are they actually, for example, designing curriculum? Are they, are they just, for example, doing something that's been set for them? What does that look like? I think one of the challenges I've seen in candidates who are recent graduates is that a lot of times they don't understand how to translate their skills for an audience who may not be familiar with a humanities PhD in particular. One of the challenges that I know, for example, working with people with PhDs and perhaps STEM fields, for example, is that the skills that they gain in a PhD program are very different, right? A lot of times they're not necessarily teaching. Their work might be more lab-based or project-based. And so in terms of skill sets, they don't necessarily inherently recognize the value of somebody with a PhD, whether that's in the humanities or in the arts or whatever that might look like. And so, when I'm reviewing resumes, I also want to see that the individual is able to articulate their skills beyond their research areas and interests. I have never once been asked about my dissertation. I have never once asked a candidate about their research interests during an interview. Now, of course, usually if we hire somebody, I'm interested to know their field of work, but that's usually not a consideration for our hiring team. The challenge for a lot of graduate students in transferring a CV into a resume is knowing what to cut out and kind of where to start. And my advice actually is to have them be two completely different concepts or ideas in your mind, and that, you don't need to start with your CV on one page and then on another monitor be looking at a blank paper and kind of copying and pasting over. In fact, I would encourage students to start from scratch, right? Like to go online, for example, and look at traditional resumes in the industries that they're applying to. Like, what is it that these are, what is the format like? What are they, visually, how are they constructed? Because while you can easily adapt the content from a CV or to a resume, they don't necessarily lend themselves for a direct application. And more importantly, I think when you are looking at a CV, you are almost, it's daunting to take something that's so long and just to start cutting it up. So instead, I would focus on kind of the big picture items. So obviously things like name, education, skills. But then in terms of the experience, really imagining what is it that for this particular role, a recruiter might be looking for. Obviously identifying, for example, buzzwords from job descriptions and focusing on accomplishment statements that concretely connect not only the value of the work that you provided, but also the outcome. I think that's a much better approach to resume writing, particularly for graduate students in the humanities. I would avoid trying to use any type of jargon that is academic in nature. Things like publications, research terms or areas, anything like that is typically going to go over the heads of a recruiter. And really the last piece of advice I would give in terms of resume writing is having different versions of your resume for different types of jobs. And I think this is something that I had, for example, when I was first applying to the job market, is I had resumes that were really geared, for example, towards instructional design type roles. And in my current role, I do some instructional design work. That looks very different than what I had on a resume when I was applying, for example, to more tech-based companies, and I have a different skill set. And so I think, translating the CV to the resume is really more about, thinking through what is a resume, what skills and experience can I bring to the table, and how can I highlight them in a way that is contemporary with my competition.